Okay, well, enjoy your stay, all of you that are here for a class reunion. At this time, I'd like to introduce Jean Kramer of the Kossuth Historical Society. Let's give her a big hand.
Thank you, Marion. Again, on behalf of the Algona branch, the AAUW, and the Kossuth County Genealogical Society and the Historical Society, we want to extend a big welcome to Voices from the Past. We especially want to thank our sponsors, the Haggard Too Good Charitable Trust and the Algona's Founders Day Committee, for their generosity, which makes it possible to present this program free of charge. Although they can't hear us, we also want to thank our actors, for without them this would be just a walk in the cemetery. So, and this year we're especially delighted to have members of the Koshillis family and the Ben Scooter and Seeley families actually portraying their ancestors. Just a reminder that there'll be a second production of the Cemetery Walk at the Masonic Hall at 1413 North McCoy Street on Sunday at 2 p.m. It's handicapped, accessible, air-conditioned, and mosquito and gnat-free. So we hope you'll spread the word to family and friends. Two other little things that we'd like to remind you of. Tomorrow evening, our Historical Society is having a food stand near our museum building downtown. We're featuring pork loin and Granny's Kitchen's famous rhubarb or apple crunch, so come on in. And then on Saturday, we're having a reception for the Koshillis family from 9 to 11 on Saturday morning. They're going to be bringing some of their family memorabilia, plus we have quite a bit that the Koshillis family donated to the Historical Society, which will be on display. So we invite you to come have coffee with Kathy, Jean, and Julie. And then our historical scavenger hunt is Saturday afternoon from 1 to 4, and we challenge any of you to come take our hunt. It's going to be based on your knowledge, how well you know Algona and the Kossuth County area. So it's just $10 for adults. The kids are free, and we promise you a good time. Just bring a digital camera of some sort, phone, iPad, whatever, and we promise that we'll make it fun. So for tonight, there are 4 stops along the route. So that means we need to break into 4 groups, and we try to kind of even up, just get the best viewing experience you have. Each group will be assigned to a guide. 4 wonderful ladies here. Each group will be starting at one of the 4 locations, and then you circle around. So please follow your guide so that you don't miss anything. And be sure to watch your steps through the cemetery. We have a few hills, so just be careful. And we would appreciate if everybody would turn off their cell phones and calls or texting during the performance. But feel free to take photos. So, with that, let's start.
And when you're done with your 4 stops, come back. I've got 200 cookies and 200 glasses of lemonade that will be arriving. And I don't want to have to take 200 cookies home. Teat Street, the long street that runs east and west right across from Ron Peck's auction area. Right on the street, if you're going to park tomorrow. Okay, let's have a 4th of the group.
So if you're looking around the cemetery, one is usually struck by the many and varied designs of the gravestones. So do look at the various designs. Just as styles come in fashions and go out in fashions, the same can be said about headstones. Due to the age of Riverview Cemetery, an interested observer can study the progression of style through the years. So let's head over to the Thompson. I'm Donna Kitzinger. I belong to the AAUW, and I'll be your narrator for all 4 sites here. So if you get lost, just look for me, the one that looks kind of Quakerish. That's what somebody told me on the way in. Okay. Gravestones traditionally have had a language all of their own. From designs and embellishments, the symbols and the inscriptions used convey something about the deceased personality. The influence of Christianity on headstones endorsements cannot be overstated. Angels, for instance, are among the most common decorations. A flying angel denotes rebirth and resurrection. A trumpeting angel denotes resurrection, and a weeping angel represents grief and mourning. You will sometimes see a lamb, which is one of the most popular sculptures to adorn the headstones of children because it stands for innocence, which may be from a reference to Jesus as the Lamb of God. Some gravestones symbols are open to several interpretations, depending on your point of view. An open book, for example, may signify learning, and an open mind but is often taken to represent the Bible. An open book also signified the tombstone as a kind of biography, or the book could be closed in recognition of the fact that the story of the dead is over. Otherwise, and oftentimes, headstones are encoded with symbols indicating the profession of the deceased. Scales etched onto the headstone indicate that the descendant was a merchant of some kind, while a hammer and an anvil represent a blacksmith. An ear of corn or a sickle is commonly used on the headstones for farmers. Deceased barbers may be denoted by bowls and razors. And headstones of ministers would, of course, frequently have the Bible used, while a wedge and a level would symbolize a masonry. Scrolls are a symbol of life and time. Both ends rolled up indicate a life that is unfolding like a scroll of uncertain length, with the past and the future hidden. A column rising up one side of the grave and broken over the top represents a broken life. Similarly, a tree trunk stands for premature death. An illuminated torch suggests enlightenment, freedom, and vigor. Upside down torches also are prevalent gravestones and are adorned on them. If the inverted torch is flaming, it signifies life after death. If there is no flame, it means extinction. Flowers are commonly found on tombstones, most of which symbolize love and purity. A dove means peace and resurrection. The wheat sheaf stands for a long, productive life. And a draped tombstone means sorrow or mourning. Joseph Root founded Woodmen of the World as a fraternal organization that would clear away problems of financial security for its members. It became involved in the community by holding dinners and dances and social events. It also provided college scholarships and held summer camps for the local youth. Now, this is my third page.
Oh, okay. Just wait because you'll do a page of each one.
Okay. So now you've got a little history before you get to the next one. Okay? All right, I wasn't instructed on that.
I was so enthralled that I didn't want her to stop, but unfortunately our gravestones aren't really that fancy, so when you walk by you will have to take a look. Can everyone hear me? Especially if you're at the back, and there is this chair here if anybody would like to sit down. I am Nancy Jane Means Thompson, and if you've been here before, other years, you've heard many stories of the pioneers that are buried here in Riverview Cemetery. And so I may not have anything that is particularly new or interesting, but I will try my best. I came to this town of Algona in 1856 and made the acquaintance of the few residents that were living there at the time. Perhaps, though, I should back up a little bit and tell you about myself. I was born in 1837, and I was born in Pennsylvania to parents of Scottish stock. My great-grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War, and my grandfather fought in the War of 1812. When I was 1 year old, my family decided to come to Jackson County, Iowa. When they arrived, my father was a carpenter, and so he built some of the first houses in Dubuque. However, unfortunately, he died when I was only 5 years old. It was a very sad time for us. But time went on, and I met my husband in 1854 in Jackson County. His name was Joseph Thompson. He had been born in Ireland of Scottish heritage. And when he was 10 years old, his family decided to move to the United States. So they came by sea and by land to Pennsylvania. And then his father, like my father, died very young. The family was scattered. But somehow he did achieve a public school education. And then he decided that life in the West would be the best for him. So he came first to Rock Island, Illinois. How many of you have lived there? No. And Jackson County, Iowa. And that's where we met. We were married on December 23rd, 1855. And then the next spring, in 1856, we had heard about the land that was fertile and cheap out here in Kossuth County around Hall's Grove. So we decided to come out here. Another man, D.W. Sample, was coming too, and so we joined forces. That gave us 2 wagons and 4 teams of oxen. So we started out from Fulton, which is where we were married, to Cascade, to Delhi, to Independence. Some of you probably have gone that way yourself. And then up to Waterloo, where we crossed the Cedar River on a ferry into Cedar Falls. Then we went on up to Belmont, and there we met some trappers who were going to Armstrong. So we followed them. And when we got to Dutch Henry's cabin in Plum Creek Township, we went south and came into what was Algona. Now, at the time we came into Algona, 1856, there were only 2 cabins in the town. One of them belonged to Judge Asa Call and his wife Sarah Heckert Call, and the other one belonged to Joe Moore. Now, Moore was keeping sort of a bachelor quarters, and so I asked them if it would be all right if I would bake some bread before we went on. So they allowed me to do that. And then we headed on to Irvington, where Mr. Sample had some friends who had come the year before. We were going to stay with them. On the way, we called at the Malachi Clark cabin. And Mr. Thompson and I were such a young-looking couple that Mrs. Clark remarked to Mr. Sample that it was very wise of him to bring his children along to the frontier. Well, he was a bachelor, and we all laughed, but it was really a fairly common mistake because I wasn't even 19 years old then. We went on to Mr. James G. Green's cabin, where we were going to stay. And when I opened the door, I was really quite downcast. There was not even a floor, not even a puncheon floor made out of split logs. It was just dirt. And over in the corner of the cabin, there was a fire burning. And then up in the roof, there was a hole so that the smoke could go out. Now, we did stay there for several weeks, but then Mr. Thompson and I decided we should go back to Algona. A wise decision, don't you think? Yeah. And so we went back. After a day or two, we made arrangements with Mr. Moore for us to live at the bachelor cabin and for me to cook for the bachelors. Now, at this time, the people living there were Dr. Taylor, or Father Taylor, I should say, who you know wasn't really a bachelor, and Lewis H. Smith, J. E. Stacy, George Lowe, Mr. Skinner, and Gad Gilbert. Now, those bachelors were so appreciative of my work, and I really did enjoy my little family. That cabin was a very busy place, though. It became the post office, and Mr. Moore was the postmaster. And then on Sundays, Father Taylor would preach in the morning. he was the congregational minister, you know. And then in the afternoon, Reverend McKibben would preach. He was the Presbyterian minister. Well, on the outskirts of Algona at that time, there were living the Risks, the Paynes, and the Blackfoots. But in June, other families arrived. The Hendersons came, and you might remember that Mr. Henderson's daughter Nancy later married Ambrose Call. And along with them came the Skanks, some more Moors, and the Rebuffs with their fine horses. The first two frame houses to be built in Algona were built by Lewis H. Smith, who built his frame house across from the southwest corner of the courthouse. I think there used to be a gas station there. Do you remember that? Maybe you do. And then the H.F. Watsons built a house where later the Inghams built their house. And then, even later, I believe now it's Oak Crest Funeral Services that is there. Most of the pioneers, when they came, brought a lot of provisions, but they would, of course, run out. And then they had to go so far, even down to Boone, to get more things. And you can imagine how long that took. So in July or August, Major Williams sent up from Fort Dodge a lot of provisions and put them on sale for us. Now, how many of you have just celebrated the 4th of July? I bet a lot of you have, right? Well, we celebrated the 4th of July in 1856 too. We did it a little differently than you do. We all met on what became North Thorrington Street by the Nicolan House. It wasn't there yet, but that was the location. And we had a nice parade with Lewis H. Smith beating on a big tin pan like a drum. And of course, there were speeches. In October of that year, Mr. Thompson and I went to our little log cabin on our preemption, which was 1.5 miles east of town. We were going to spend the winter there, of course, but the winter of 1856 and 57 was one of the worst on record. It was extremely cold, and drifts were starting to come across the roads very early in the year. The people in town, especially our friends, the bachelors, and some of the other people that we knew, started to get worried about us. So they wrote a petition inviting us to come into town and spend the winter with the Watsons. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, how hospitable could people be? They sent a messenger on foot with a petition, and he arrived on December 23rd at our cabin. Now, that was our 1-year anniversary. And he asked us to come with him the next day, so we did. We loaded up everything, got some shovels, and we thought we would make it probably 1.5 miles a day. That did not work out. So we had to go back to our cabin. The next day was Christmas Day, and we were going to try it all over again. So we did. This time, with a lot of effort on all of our parts, we made it. And we got to the Watsons' cabin just at sunset and had the best Christmas meal that I can ever remember, before or after. That winter was so severe that we were still at the Watsons in March of the following spring. And that's when we heard about the Spirit Lake Massacre. So, at that time, people from outside of Algona and all of us in Algona went to the Hendersons' log hotel. And we stayed there for 3 days while the men diligently built a fort around the city hall, which is kind of where Schweizer's is now. And then we stayed there until the danger was over. That fall, my mother, who had also come to Algona and owned some land, decided that she wanted to go back to Jackson County. And I decided to go with her. By that time, I had a little baby, and my younger brother was going along. So we went back to Jackson County for the winter, and in April of the next year, we came back to Algona. By that time, it was my little baby, my brother, and my brother-in-law and I. It was very rainy that spring. The roads were practically non-existent, and there were no bridges. It was a very difficult journey. And when we got about 5 or 6 miles southeast of Irvington, we came to Prairie Creek. The water was rising, so we decided we'd better go across Prairie Creek right away. We got in the middle, and the wheels were stuck in the mud. We were in a prairie schooner with a yoke of oxen. We couldn't get out. So we spent the night there, and the next morning my brother-in-law volunteered to walk to Algona to get help. I spent all day in that wagon, holding my baby girl in my arms, with my brother with me, and no help was coming. We were so afraid that they would never find us. When dusk came, I held up a tallow candle, hoping that someone would see the light and be able to find us. Finally, at 11 o'clock at night, my husband and my brother-in-law came with 2 more yokes of oxen. They really tried to pull us out, but they could not. And so we had to just get out of the wagon and go to the nearest cabin. Guess which one it was? Mr. Green's. It looked pretty good that night. And the next morning we came on into Algona. It was almost a month before we managed to get that wagon out. You know, there was a lot of tragedy on the prairie, and that night could have been very tragic for us. But there was also fun and romance. While we were gone to Jackson County, my husband and Jerome Stacy decided that they would just set up their bachelor quarters out at our cabin. And the people in town started thinking that maybe they needed a little break from their own company and their own cooking. So a bunch of young people got into a sled carrying provisions and a nice warm meal and took it out to them. And that, I believe, was the first time that Mr. Jerome Stacy met his future Mrs. Stacy, Miss Harriet Taylor. In 1861, times were very bad here. There was no work. And so we decided again to go back to Jackson County. My uncle had built a large sawmill, and he had offered a job to Mr. Thompson. We hired a team of horses and a wagon to get to the nearest railroad, which happened to be in Cedar Falls. And so we got that far. Then we had a dressed pig with us, and we were going to sell that in order to buy our tickets. Well, the first offer we had was 1 cent a pound for that pig. But we actually got 1.5 cents, and we were really grateful because that gave us enough money to get train tickets and go on. Mr. Thompson in 1864 decided that he should go to the gold fields of Idaho and Montana. So he went out there. He built the first building in Helena, and he stayed there for 4 years. When he came back, we weren't wealthy, but we had enough money to keep the wolf from the door. So we came back to Algona and stayed on our farm for 3 more years. Then in 1870, or for 2 more years, because in 1870, when the train first came through Algona, and that was the Milwaukee and St. Paul, we sold that farm. It's now called the Old Lund Place, I think. But we sold that farm for the incredible price of $40 an acre, the most spent on farmland at that time in this area. And then we bought another farm 3 miles north of Algona, which Mr. Thompson improved and then ran on practical terms for the next 31 years until his death in 1901. At that time, he owned 160 acres on that farm plus 40 acres in Plum Creek and was one of the biggest farmers in the district. Mr. Thompson and I had 6 children. Mamie, who was Mrs. Joseph Hophius, they had a farm 2 miles north of Algona. Carrie, who was Mrs. Cyrus Blossom, he was a cashier in the bank at Burt. Henry, who was a supervisor over in Whittemore. Frank, who lived on the old home farm. Jenny, who always lived with me, and Clifford, who later on went to Minnesota. And in 1911, Jenny and I moved to Algona. And I had to laugh when I compared the place that I had first seen with its 2 log houses to the thriving community we lived in then. We had a very nice, modern, comfortable house on East Call Street, just 2 doors from the Presbyterian Church. And I would look out the windows and see all the children walking by and think of the 3 unmarried young girls, the 2 Heckerts and Nancy Henderson, that were in town that first summer. It does, though, make me very sad when I think back to all those families, heads of families that came into Algona around the same time I did. And of all those pioneers, I am now the only lady left. I am here now. I died in 1916, and I am buried by all of my family and many of my friends, and we are waiting for the last trumpet call. Thank you.
There are a couple of people that joined us too, and that way we'll get right to their talk. I want you to look when we're walking down this hill too to some of the symbols that I was talking about, the headstones having, and the symbols on them with the scales and the hammer and the anvil and the corn or ear of corn and the barber, if you recall what I said about them. And the Bibles are usually frequently used on the headstones of ministers, while a wedge and a level symbolize masonry. And then the scrolls on the tombstones. Look at them, because you might have a little bit more time to kind of look at them instead of hustling over here like we had from the last one. So you might want to look at the scrolls on them, and also the flowers, if there are some. I don't see too many flowers right now because, you know, our rules have changed very much on the types of things on the left out on the tombstones. So I'm going to turn it over to Dean, and I don't know your name. Kendra. Kendra. Okay. Okay.
I'm Oliver Van Ben Scooter. Although my family name has changed a few times over the generations, when my family arrived in the colonies in 1671, our name was Van Ben Schoten from our hometown in Holland. By the time I came to Iowa, I was known as Oliver Van Ben Scooter. My daughter here, Alice, dropped the Van and was called Alice Ben Scooter. Name changes were quite common among immigrants. My life was one of adventure and hard work. I was born in October of 1816 in Connecticut, but my mother Elizabeth had barely recovered from my birth before my father William packed our small family into a covered wagon, headed west to Ohio along with my grandparents, my 2 aunts, and an uncle. It took us 3 weeks to travel to Buffalo, New York. After that, the roads were so bad that we sent our heaviest goods by water in order to lighten our loads. Of course, I don't remember anything of the trip, but later my mother spoke of her concern for my health and that of my sister Esther, who was only 3 years old during the cold fall weather. We finally arrived and settled near Ceylon, Ohio, living in wagons until Father and Uncle Daniel could put up a log house for us. My father and Daniel were both inherited the Van Ben Schoten height and strength, so it didn't take long to build a cabin. By 1818, my father was a taxpayer and well enough known to be elected a county supervisor.
Moving west meant moving backwards in comforts and conveniences. My father remembered his mother talking of lard for pies in Connecticut while he had only rabbit and bear fat. Wild berries took the place of apples, and frozen pumpkin pulp boiled down to juice substituted for molasses. For light at night, a strip of cloth with an edge for a wick wrapped around a button and floated in bear oil had to suffice. If Grandma needed more light, she put the saucer of bear oil on top of a bowl or sat near the fire. Father's main school book was the Bible, and study sessions and sewing were the main reasons for makeshift lamps of any kind. Needless to say, the family usually went to bed soon after dark.
My father was kind to us, thrifty and energetic. After his arrival in Ohio, he cleared a farm, set out an orchard, despite the presence of wolves and bears in the western region. The neighbors told of traveling in groups for safety to the nearest mill, 75 miles away, to have grain ground for flour. When Father was with them, they stayed up all night inside the mill wrapped in buffalo robes while he entertained them with funny stories, even though they were exhausted. And they then returned with their bags of grits slung on their horses. I was a witness to that, and later traveled on my own over the Indian trails with it when another mill was built only 30 miles from home. It was a great shock when my father, such a hardy man in the prime of his strength, died on April 18, 1833. He had an infection shortly after a wind was removed from his neck. I was only 16 at the time, and this was the first disaster for our family.
The second followed less than a year later when my grandmother Elizabeth followed her William to the grave in Ohio.
With my mother's death, my family was broken up, and my younger sisters and brothers, ranging in age from 2 to 13, were parceled out among my aunts and uncles. I was already known as an excellent blacksmith, so I was welcome in any cabin. The following year, I married Martha Kemp, who was 16 at the time. She had been trained at her mother's knee for a life of a frontier wife, and I was in love and lonely after the sudden death of my parents. I was also looking for new land as my father had in his youth. Horses were my passion, and I hitched up a good team and traveled as far as the Rock River County in western Illinois, which looked very promising to me. However, my young wife's family persuaded me to stay in Ohio, and I did that for another 20 years.
We were so proud of my father. People who were having trouble with their horses' feet came from miles away to have him shoe them. For a time, he went to Vermilion in the Dakotas to do the iron work on a couple of river schooners, and my older brother William and I remember well the months he spent in the Straits of Mackinac to help build a lighthouse. He did all the iron work in it while Mother, William, and I, along with our 4 younger brothers and sisters, did all of the farm chores until he came back.
Yes, I was also a farmer and was in demand as one of the best cradlers during the wheat harvest. I will admit that, like any good workman, I was sure that I knew the best way to do a job and didn't take advice graciously.
Besides my farm chores and the ones in the house too, I was able to realize my dream of going to Oberlin College, a fine institution that first admitted women in 1837, 2 years before my birth. That soon changed.
My yen to move west became too strong for me to resist. So I sold my fine farm, decided to stake a claim in Kasuth County, Iowa, where I had heard that there was good land and no other blacksmith. I knew that Alice was adventurous and a strong girl, and I decided to take her with me. I hoped that we would get there in time to build a dwelling and stake our claim. It was quite late that fall when we started out.
Of course, I had to drop out of college, and so did William, who was almost ready to graduate. I would have an exciting new experience, but he had to stay home and run the farm and then get the rest to Iowa in the spring. Father and I only made it as far as Delaware County, where we had to hole up until February. We set out then on a very tedious journey through deep snow in a countryside where there were few settlers. Finally, we reached Fort Dodge and were able to make the rest of the journey to Algona on the river.
I set to work right away building a cabin. I used the deserted hut log hut as a blacksmith shop. Sometimes I worked until midnight, then rose again at daylight to continue my work. As soon as people knew of my smithing ability, there was no lack of jobs. People came from miles around, and Alice would cook for them while they waited, sometimes for days, while I finished the work they brought.
The rest of our family traveled to Dubuque by rail, where they put their three-seated wagon together and started west. There were no bridges, so they had to ford every river. Due to an Indian scare in northern Iowa the year before, they saw many deserted cabins along the way. When they were lucky enough to stay overnight with the family, the younger children entertained themselves by playing with the geese and the ducks, cats, and dogs that shared the cabin. They remembered that they seldom slept in a bed and that the meals were nothing compared to the good ones at home.
It was a shock for my wife and younger family when they arrived at our new home place, but it was not long before they settled in. It was a good move for me and the children, but my hard-working wife, Martha, died only a year after arriving in Iowa. Alice took care of the family like a responsible girl that she's always been. My business flourished. During the Indian outbreak in 1862, a company of cavalry was stationed 50 miles north in Minnesota. I took on the job of shoeing all their horses. In those days, a smith had to make all his own shoes and even the nails for shoeing. I worked nearly day and night to get the shoes made, and my sons learned to turn shoes with sledges. When the work was done, I would head to Minnesota, and in the bitter cold, but I always made it through. Sometimes I shod 16 teams a day and was a very bad horse that I could not handle.
In 1862, Father remarried, this time to Sarah Crows, who bore him 10 more children, making 16 altogether. Father also owned a hotel and always had good horses in his stable. He had a long-distance carting business, acquired several properties in Algona, and served as sheriff in Kossuth County for 6 years. He was a staunch Republican and a large, strong, fine-looking man who was good company for the old and young alike. Even before Father remarried, my brothers and sisters were of an age to take over my duties, and Andrew Seeley and I were courting.
Andrew was another of the early Kossuth pioneers. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1829, the youngest of 12 children. His father died when he was only 4 months old, and his mother and the children moved on to Ohio. When he was only 9, his mother died too, and he was raised first by a cousin, then was bound out to farmers. At 14, he finally received 3 months of schooling, and then at 15, he was an apprentice to a tailor to learn his trade.
It was a lonely and bewildering life for Andrew, but he learned a trade that might give him a steady job and served his apprenticeship in 5 years. Andrew began moving west, earning his living by working by the piece. He was always a better tailor than I was. Even he longed for a more adventurous life. His brother was also trained as a tailor, so the two of them decided to start a shop in Cedar Rapids.
Andrew's brother didn't like tailoring, so they sold their business. Andrew rented another building to continue making clothes. In the rugged West, there was little demand for tailored suits, so Andrew turned to carpentry and hunting and fishing to supplement his meager earnings. William Ingen, living in Cedar Rapids at the time, and he and Andrew shared a love of the outdoor and hunting. Ingham made a trip to Kossuth County in the fall of 1854 to claim some land and needed a partner to return with him as soon as possible. They made a deal that they would try Kossuth County for 1 year. That 1 year has turned into a lifetime for both. Now, 5 more generations of Seeleys and Benscooters have called Kossuth County home.
I love the part of Andrew's story where he said that neither he nor Ingham knew how to cook, so it took them a long time to figure out a list of provisions needed to last for a year. They did know enough to substitute clay pipes for cigars. Andrew also had to make one last suit of clothes for a customer in the 2 weeks before they set out for Algona. They hired L.W. Moore as their teamster for the 200-mile trip, and he stayed on to help establish a cabin for all the bachelors in the tiny town. Andrew eventually wrote the story of their trip, and it's a treasure for both the Ben Scooters and the Seeleys, filled with humorous little tales of unloading the whole wagon to find the one pan they needed for cooking, or coming down an icy hill with the cart before the horses.
They finally arrived at Ingham's Claim north of Algona in January of 1855. It was very mild then, and they soon built a 14 by 18 foot log cabin, moved in on February 17th. From then until fall, the two traveled around the area, making trips to Minnesota, to Spirit Lake, and back to Cedar Rapids. They were called upon to raise many cabins, including Asa Call's in town. They entertained friends from Cedar Rapids, broke about 5 acres of ground, did a lot of hunting. Two bachelors with their skills were welcome wherever they went.
You can see why I was attracted to this quiet man of so many talents. He was a natural-born hunter and frontiersman, and even to the last, he loved the double-barreled muzzle loader that shot the only buffalo ever taken by a settler in Kossuth County, and too many elk and deer to count. His word was sterling, and he would go without luxuries or conveniences to avoid debt. We were married for 35 years and had 5 children, including James, the only son, who lived to carry on the Seeley name in this area and by whose tombstone we sit. Andrew suffered a severe stroke, and died on April 22, 1896. I missed him every day until my death on December 15 of 1912.
Root founded the Woodmen of the World as a fraternal organization that would clear away any financial securities for its members. It became involved in the community by holding dinners, dances, and society events. It also provided college scholarships and held summer camps for the youth. However, the Woodmen of the World organization was probably best known for its gravestones. Beginning in 1890 through the mid-1920s, their life insurance policies for members that provided for grave markers, originally free of charge and later with the purchase of a policy rider. The society designed a 4 to 5 foot high tree trunk monument pattern for adults and 3 staked logs for children. The organization would send a copy of the pattern to a local stone carver in the deceased woodman's hometown so that all of the trees that were stones would be similar in appearance. But other decorations were added to the tree trunk, whereby making each marker more individualistic. Many times the tree stone pattern was altered, sized differently, cut in a different manner, or branches were added or broken off each time a family member was buried. I'll turn it over to Scott.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Merrill Call, and I welcome you to the family tomb. 4 generations of my family are buried here, including my great-grandmother Polly Metcalf Call, my grandparents Judge Asa C. Call, and Sarah Heckart Call, my father Asa Frank Call. I was placed here for my eternal rest following a heinous crime that took place at the tender age of 26. I was born in Algona and spent much of my youth here until my parents moved to Sioux City when I was 10. I never lost my love for Algona and visited often, especially my mother's parents, Mr. and Mrs. D.H. Hutchins. I was an active cyclist. In fact, when I was 16, I rode a bicycle here from Sioux City, making the trip in just under 16 hours. Earlier that same year, I placed 3rd in a 5-mile bicycle race at the county fair, and I won myself a fine sweater. I understand you now have an event called RAGBRAI, during which you ride a cycle across the state of Iowa. I do think I would have enjoyed that event very much. I completed high school in Sioux City and later studied engineering at Purdue University. At the age of 20, I became the superintendent of the Sioux City streetcar lines. In 1903, I married Lucy Tullerton of Toledo, Ohio, and we later had a daughter, Mary. After our marriage, I agreed to take a job in the Tullerton family business Lucy's father, in company with a number of Toledo associates, owned considerable mining property located in the Yaqui Indian country in the state of Sonora, Mexico. Among the holdings of the group in the Yaqui country was a smelter at Toledo Camp, 35 miles from the nearest railroad station. I had been recently made manager at a salary of $10,000 per year, which was more than a state senator at the time. A trip was organized to inspect some nearby mining properties for the Yaqui Mining and Smelting Company, of which my father-in-law was a stockholder. There were 8 members in our party, which included 4 other employees, 2 Mexican drivers, and Charles Tullerton, my wife's cousin, who came along for a pleasure trip. It was on this trip that I met my fate. Realizing the unsettled and restless condition of the Yaqui, before setting out on our expedition, we had put in a request for a guard. The Mexican authorities declared an escort to be unnecessary on account of the number in our party and the fact that the Indians were not particularly hostile to Americans. Determined to reach the mines at any cost, we set out without the guard, heavily armed with 6-shooters and shotguns. Charles also had a rifle and a dagger. We had completed the inspection of properties at Camp Toledo, and we were returning in late afternoon to La Colorado, a distance of about 75 miles. We were traveling in 2 4-horse stages. I was traveling in the second stage with Charles and 2 others. We proceeded along a broken road, each side of which was thickly grown with mesquite grass. The road itself was much traveled and not considered very dangerous. Great quantities of silver bullion were hauled over the road every day to the railroad for shipment. Unaware of any lurking danger, we proceeded along the desert road. The horses were trotting slowly, the Mexican drivers sitting atop. A low hill rose from one side of the road, which passed around the foot of the hill in the winding course and was lost in the distance. Inside the stages, we were chatting pleasantly when suddenly, without warning, there was a volley at close range and bullets whizzed in all directions. Everybody jumped out of the stages in an instant. Herbert Miller, a passenger in the first stage, was familiar with the country and its dangers and yelled, "For God's sakes, boys, run! It's the only way we can be saved!" At a ranch house where we had stopped not long before, the members of the party were joshing each other about being so heavily armed, and it had been generally agreed that we would be better good to run than to stand and be shot in case we were attacked by the Yaqui. But in this most critical of moments, many of us refused to run. However, when Miller gave the warning, Charles threw down his rifle and ran. Charles, Miller, and one of the Mexican drivers took to their heels, and they were the only 3 who made it out alive. The Indians must have numbered 75 from the way they fired. The bullets came thick and fast after me and buzzed in my ears. The first volley killed the Mexican driver of the second stage, and he reeled off the rig, his body riddled in bullets. Another volley snuffed out the lives of 2 party members who fell in their tracks after jumping from the first stage. A passenger in our stage, Walter Stubinger, was the next victim. He was killed just after leaving our rig. One of the 4 horses from the first stage was killed by a bullet from one of the rifles, and the Mexican driver leaped to the ground and made it up the hill. At the first volley, I jumped to the ground and took refuge behind a stump, where I used my shotgun in hope of affording escape to the other members of the party. I took 1 shot to the abdomen, but I was able to struggle up to my knees and continued pouring shot into the Indians until a bullet in my neck ended my life. The Indians frightened the horses, and they started up the road at breakneck speed. As it rounded the turnhill, Charles was barely able to clutch the end of the gate of the wagon, swinging himself into the vehicle, drove with all speed toward the town, with 5 Indians in hot pursuit yelling and shooting. After traveling several miles, one of the horses fell dead. Charles quickly leaped from the wagon, cutting the lead team loose from the pole, the stage, threw an overcoat over one of the horses, leaping on him and continuing his mad ride. The Indians stopped their pursuit when they reached the stage. Charles rode on to Cobachi, about 10 miles from where the attack had occurred. The village was made up of Mexican ranchers who did not speak English. It took some time to find anyone who could understand English. Miller, in the meantime, had made good escape, and closely followed by the Mexican driver, hastened to a town in another direction, running the entire distance. He exclaimed the attack to the inhabitants of the town, and a rescuing party was quickly made up and hurried to the scene of the attack. Miller, in the meantime, when the party arrived, the Indians had escaped. The Indians had stripped all the bodies, and they had been beaten with rocks and clubs. Our bodies were removed to the home of a nearby rancher. The next day, our bodies were delivered under heavy guard into the hands of the undertaker to prepare for shipment home. It was only after all arrangements had been made that Miller finally had his own injuries treated. He had been shot in the hip and endured his pain and suffering until he was satisfied the bodies were safely returned. My body was returned to Sioux City for funeral services. From there, I traveled by special funeral train to Algona, accompanied by my wife, my parents, and other family and friends. The funeral cortege arrived in Algona very early in the morning, and the party remained in the sleeper until 7 a.m., when friends from the Algona area sent carriages and brought them to the Durdal Hotel for breakfast. My casket was removed from the train to the Call family vault here at Riverview Cemetery. The interior of the tomb was banked with carnations and roses. A short service was conducted by Reverend Holmes. There was a large audience of sympathizing friends and family at the interment, despite the 0-degree weather prevailing. And although it was originally thought that the attackers were Yaqui Indians following the massacre, Herbert Miller found inconsistencies and continued to investigate the matter. Yaqui Indians were known to purchase their ammunition in the United States. Empty shells picked up on the ground at the scene of the tragedy were of the Monsieur type, which convinced him that they were purchased or obtained in Mexico, as the Monsieur was very little used in the United States. He became very confident that it was the Mexicans and not the Yaqui Indians who were responsible for the murders. During a follow-up trip to Mexico, the governor of Sonora demanded a meeting with Miller, at which he accused him of plotting against the Mexican government. In fact, the governor went to accuse Miller himself of committing the murders, claiming that his mines were worthless and that he did not want the rest of the party to give out bad report. So Miller had us all killed. Further, the governor demanded that Miller provide him with a statement relieving the Mexican government from all responsibility. Of course, Miller refused to do so. Miller joined forces with my Uncle Joe Harry Call of Los Angeles and ex-Senator John M. Thurston of Nebraska to pursue an indemnity claim for $450,000 against the Mexican government. He was convinced that it was his duty and the duty of the United States to demand instant protection for Americans from the Mexican government. It threatened to turn into an international incident. My death was a particular blow to my parents, as I was their last surviving child. My brother Joe succumbed to typhoid several years before my death, leaving me to carry on the family name. Many dreams, my parents died with me that day. In fact, their grief was such a strain on their relationship that they later divorced. Following my death, my widow and daughter moved to Sioux City to live with my father, and then moved to Sonoma County, California, where my father owned a citrus farm. It was near that home where my father was hit by a train and killed a few years after my death. Although he wished his ashes to be scattered as though he had never existed, they are interred here with me. My precious little Mary, his sole heir. In 1914, Lucy married Richard Kirkland. She went on to have a second daughter and lived to the age of 97. She remained in California for the rest of her life and is buried at Riverside, so very, very far from here. This is where my story ends and where I will rest for eternity. I still feel great sadness that my life was snuffed out so quickly, that I never had a chance to tell my loved ones goodbye. Lucy and I had such a delightful marriage, and we were looking forward to having more children and many more happy years together. My final thoughts were of Lucy and of our dear Mary, who was so young that she would never know me. Thank you for visiting here today. in listening to my story.
The tradition of leaving coins on the headstones of military men and women can be traced as far back as the Roman Empire. Coins have distinct meanings when left on the headstones of those who gave their lives while serving in America's military. And these meanings vary depending on the denomination of the coin. A coin left on a headstone or at a gravesite is meant as a message to the deceased soldier's family that someone else has visited the grave to pay respect. Leaving a penny at the grave means simply that you visited. A nickel indicates that you and the deceased trained at boot camp together, while a dime means you served with him in some capacity. By leaving a quarter at the grave, you are telling the family that you were with the soldier when he was killed. According to tradition, the money left at graves in national cemeteries and state veterans cemeteries is eventually collected, and the funds are put together toward maintaining the cemetery or paying burial costs for some of the veterans. In the United States, this practice became common, especially during the Vietnam War, due to the political divide in the country over the war. Leaving a coin was seen as a more practical way to communicate that you had visited the grave that containing the soldier's contacting the soldier's family, which could devolve into an uncomfortable argument over politics relating to the war. Some Vietnam veterans would leave coins as a down payment to buy their fallen comrades a beer or play a hand of cards when they would finally be reunited. And now, the Crushillas family.
Good evening. I am Theodore Crushillas. I was born on January 8, 1836 in the Kingdom of Bavaria, now the largest state in Germany. May I introduce my wife with her maiden name, Elise Lukai.
My father's name was famous in Germany, where he was a well-known professor, but he saw America as the land of opportunity. When Theodore and I were married in 1860, he was pleased to write a letter to friends in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to sponsor us. It was a little frightening, but also exhilarating, to pack a few of our wedding things, Theodore's silk tie, my kid gloves, and the little wreath that I wore in my hair, and 6 silver spoons in a trunk along with things necessary for our new lives.
We soon moved to Whitewater, Wisconsin, where I opened a German-English academy and taught there until 1866. Our son Julius was born there in 1862. Teaching was only a stepping stone to financial success. So, after I made a little money, we moved to Lansing, Iowa, where I went into general merchandising with Mueller Brothers.
Theodore always had a curiosity bone, and in 1870, he took the inaugural Milwaukee and St. Paul train ride from Kalmar to Algona, where the line ended. He stayed overnight and was so impressed by the town of Algona that he came home bubbling with new ideas for a life there. His enthusiasm affected me as well, and we packed up our things, including our keepsakes from our wedding, and our children, Julius and Emma, and moved there by train.
I opened a general mercantile store on Thorington Street across from the courthouse. The business moved to State Street in 1879. In 1888, I took on Max Terpst as my partner. Fire destroyed the State Street building in 1889, but Max and I decided to rebuild on the same location, this time a 2-story brick building. Shortly after this, the Crucilla store was moved to the location that was its home until it closed in 1990. From 1870 to 1890, I don't mind saying that I prospered through the store and investment in farmland. By 1885, I was able to give each of my children, Robert, Julius, and Emma, money for a good start on their futures.
We were very proud of our children. Robert never married, but he wrote beautiful poetry and was considered by his teachers to be a genius. Emma went to school in Algona and later to St. Mary's School in St. Louis with Mary Call. She married an Algona lawyer and they lived at various locations in Chicago, New York, and San Diego. Julius invested his money in a small loan company in Minneapolis, but that was not a success. We were thankful that he returned to Algona to work in the family business.
In 1889, I turned my business over to my son Julius and Max Herbst and retired. We had always lived in a small house at 200 West Call, but in 1905, I had the green shingled house built at 315 North Thorrington. It was the first architect-planned house in our city.
Theodore was a modest man, but he contributed greatly to our community. When the Methodists opened their college in 1871 on South Harlan Street, he soon became professor of German there. He served on the board of the Kossuth County State Bank and was a city trustee for many years.
In 1914, Robert, Elise, and I went to live in San Diego to be near our daughter, Emma. In 1915, I sold the shingled house to our grandson, Theodore Henry, because I was already ill and knew that I would not return to Iowa. I died that year.
Briefly, I lived on in San Diego with Robert and then died shortly after my Theodore. We were both buried in San Diego.
I'm Julius. My dad pointed out I failed in business. Even after 90 years, he criticized me. It was hard for me to return to Algona and see Dad. After my business fiasco in Minneapolis, after all, everyone here knew me. I had attended Algona schools and Algona College before I graduated from the State University of Iowa at Iowa City in 1884. It did turn out best, however. Father's partner, Max Herbst, died, so I ran the store alone. I also became very active in the life of our community, serving as a bank board member, the city treasurer, and the mayor in 1898. During my term as mayor, electric lights and sewers were installed and the public library was open. In addition, I served as a school board member. All of these things my dad couldn't handle. When my son Theo married, the shingle-style house was too small for our two families, so Guta and I moved to what was known as the first grand house on North Thorrington, just south of the shingle house. My grandchildren loved to play in the big porch, and our little granddaughter Ruth Ann often spent weekends with Guta and me, and even had her own bedroom in the large house. Things were never the same after her death from meningitis at the age of 9. I died in 1938 and Guta in 1945.
Thank you, Dad. I was obviously a more successful businessman than you were. Well, I'm Theo, and I'm the grandfather of three of the Crucilla's children that are here today, my bride Kathy, Julie, and Jean. But as a third generation to run the Crucilla store, I knew how important this business was to Algona and the surrounding area. Women came here to buy silk stockings and going away ensembles, and then later to buy fabrics to make their children's baptismal gowns and prom dresses. However, my passion was the arts. I started drawing as a young child and never quit. This is an example here of some of the drawings that I did. I was a prolific writer and a sketcher who wrote in my diary, including a drawing at the end of each day during my time at Beloit College and subsequently at the University of Minnesota. And I might add that all of the children have a hardbound copy of that diary along with the drawings, which are phenomenal. Later, I wrote and illustrated many books about my travels. These books were annually sent as Christmas gifts to friends. Even the restroom at the Chrisella store was decorated with my work. I was the president of the local library board for between 40 and 50 years. I also wrote a movie review column for the Algona Advance for many years. My wife Irene and I were members of the First Congregational Church. Irene had an extensive spoon collection that some of you might remember. We also had 4 children who made the shingle-style house a very lively place: Ted, Jack, Julian, and Ruth Ann. Ruth Ann died young, and as you may know, but Ted and Jack continued the tradition of owning the Chrisella store, and Julian was the publisher of the Algona Advance and a local businessman as well. One of my most poignant memories was of riding the last passenger train to leave from Algona around 1960. My son Ted and my grandson Gene went along on the trip. We all felt like our journey was symbolic of the closing of an era which began when my grandfather Theodore arrived in our town.
My father, Ted, who is also buried here, was one of the 4th generation to own the Chrisella store. He grew up in the shingle-style house on North Thornton and remembered playing with many neighborhood children and roaming the woods on the north end of the street. He graduated from Beloit College in Beloit, Wisconsin in 1942 and immediately joined the Navy. During World War II, he was awarded the Silver Star for leading the invasion of Salerno in a rocket boat. He said he was assigned as the leader because he had learned how to manage a small boat up at Lake Okoboji. Later, in Algona, he was the president of the Algona Country Club, where he and Grace often golfed, and served as president of both the Junior Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber of Commerce. Ted was also a very proud member of the Lions Club. My mother, Grace, was from Eagle Grove and used to ride with Champ Martin to school every day. Champ was a longtime wrestling coach here in Algona. She met my dad in Fort Dodge in 1948. It was a whirlwind courtship, and they were married 5 months later. After living in a couple of apartments in Algona, they bought a house at 310 South Dodge and lived there with their growing family until 1960, when they moved into their lovely modern home with its sweeping view of the Des Moines River. They were gracious hosts on many occasions there. Grace was very active in the First Congregational Church and Chapter BW of PEO. She also loved her weekly sewing club and bridge club. Kathy, Julie, and Jean are their children. Ted and his brother Jack were the last owners of the Chrisella store, which closed in 1990 after 120 years in business. My uncle Jack and Aunt Joan are living in Florida. Jack's 88, and Julie and Pat are living in Okoboji, and he's 91.
Tell us who you are right now.
For real?
So we can put it together.
For real.
I'm the oldest. I'm Kathy, and this is my husband Tom, and we live in Des Moines.
I'm Julie, I'm in the middle, and I live in Dubuque. I'm with Mike. Mike Devine. He lives in Fort Dodge, and I think eventually we'll get together in the same town. We're working on it.
And I'm Gene, and that's my wife Betsy down there, and we live in Iowa City.
So
And this
you
is
are,
Betsy.
so you are all Ted's children.
Yeah.
We're all Ted's children.
Ted and Grace.
Ted
and Grace.
I'm sorry. Ted
And
and Grace.
Grace.
It does take 2.
This is Jean's wife, also known as Batgirl.
Girl.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
being
you.